I think it's less important what comes up and more important what we do with it. There's a notion of what's called a critical eruption, which is something that happens in your practice that seems really negative but propels your practice forward. And then there's also an obstacle, something that's a hindrance to your practice, that's an obstacle to realization or to progressing on the spiritual path. And so at one point I asked Tukosan Rinpoche, well, what's the difference between the two of them? Because in the moment when negative things come up, they feel terrible. So how do you know if it's a critical eruption, something that's moving your practice forward, or an obstacle, something that's hindering your practice? And he said that it's what you do with it that matters. And that the only way to judge your practice is to see where your devotion and your compassion are. If your devotion and compassion are increasing, then your practice is going well. So regardless of how things seem or how things feel, it's all about how you react to things.
I'm Olivia Clementine, and this is Love and Liberation. Today, our guest is Beth Lee-Herbert. Beth finished a solitary 3-year retreat in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition in 2012 at Taramandala, a Buddhist retreat center in Colorado dedicated to the sacred feminine, founded by Lama Tsultrim Alyon. She was appointed by Tulku Sanak Rinpoche as Salung Lopen, or teacher of the practices related to the subtle channels and winds. She recently completed her master's degree in counseling psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute and will begin working as a therapist shortly. So Beth, I'm so happy that you're here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
And I want to begin, well, first of all, I haven't even mentioned that you told me that today is the day that you came out of retreat 6 years ago. Like, yeah. What an auspicious, or what a coincidence. I don't know if it's auspicious for my podcast, but it's definitely a coincidence.
It's an amazing coincidence.
Yeah.
I didn't realize until this morning that today marks exactly 6 years since I finished 3-year retreat.
So incredible. So I would love to start by getting into that. So in our Western world, few people go on solitary retreat and few people go for 3 years. And so I'm so curious what motivated you to go to a tiny cabin in the mountains and to practice for that period of time?
Well, it actually wasn't really something I ever thought that I would do. Most people who do 3-year retreat have deep aspiration and spend years preparing and really have heartfelt motivation. And for me, it was the exact opposite of that. I just landed in 3-year retreat without really setting that intention. I had been in a retreat for about 3 weeks. That was a really intense solitary retreat. I had been doing like month retreats each year. Mm-hmm. And I was in this 3-week retreat, and I started reading the biography of Shabkar, the autobiography, which is just incredibly inspiring.
Who's Shabkar? Can you tell us, for those who don't know?
Shabkar was this amazing wandering yogi who was just so delighted in practice, and who wrote poems and songs about his experience. And his autobiography has been translated by Mathieu Ricard. And it's just a beautiful record of what it's like to be in retreat, mm-hmm. and the joy of retreat and the challenges of retreat. So I was reading this book, and I felt really inspired, but of course still with the idea, I do these month retreats. This is, I'm working and I do these month retreats, and this is my practice. And I came out of retreat and actually had a really difficult time coming out of retreat, had a really difficult experience coming out. And in that difficulty, in that darkness, I found this seed of light of, I want to do long retreat. And of course, it was coming from the depths, and my conscious mind I thought to myself, oh, this is going to pass. You're having a hard time right now. It's just hard coming out of retreat. And so I just waited for that to pass. and it never did. And so I decided to go into a year-long retreat, which was absolutely terrifying to me. I couldn't imagine spending that much time alone. And it wasn't something that I wanted for myself. It was something that I was deeply called to do. And then once I ended up in retreat, I ended up finding a cycle of teachings that found me, and I just continued in retreat. And then once 3 years passed, that was it. And as much as I wanted to stay in retreat for longer than that, that was the karma that I had. And so it's definitely not the usual experience of people doing 3-year retreat where they really, I don't know, want to. But it was really this depth of inner call that I felt like I had to do it. And as if I didn't do it, that somehow I wouldn't be able to be a spiritual person, or I wouldn't be able to have integrity if I didn't do it.
I really appreciate that. That's kind of the choiceless. It was completely choiceless. Like, it wasn't, you didn't think about it. You just ended up doing all of this. And yet it also sounded like there was quite a consistent progression of being in month-long solitary retreat. So it wasn't totally foreign.
Yeah, it really made me understand that our choices in life are in our own. That sometimes there are these deeper callings, and sometimes there are things that we're called to do, and that the life just opens. And it's just jumping through those windows. Before I went into retreat, I was absolutely terrified. I was completely afraid of what it would be like to be alone in my own head. And it was harder than I anticipated, but I had far more resources than I anticipated, far more inner resources than I thought I had.
Will you say more about that?
I think the people who think that retreat is blissful and amazing and one spiritual high after another are people who haven't spent enough time alone. And for me personally, it's always been a challenge to be alone in my mind and to be alone in my head and all of that. And so I didn't have any illusions that it would be some kind of blissful experience. And yet finding the spiritual connection in retreat, and that being the only source of solace, was incredible. And was also, so at the same time as it was the most difficult thing I've ever done, it was also the happiest I've ever been. So and kind of at the same time, it's the most honest experience of being with yourself.
Well, when I think of you just as a super joyful person. You're very quick to laugh. You have a way of communicating about maybe the tougher human experiences, or you just have this real lightness about you since I've known you, at least. And I'm curious if some of that expanded by being in retreat, by being in your own mind for so long, having your own kind of silly experiences and no one else is there to witness them.
To be honest, I don't really know how retreat changed me because I can't see that far, I could tell in retreat. I felt like in retreat every 6 weeks there was a shift, that was like a period of time where things change in my practice, 6 weeks somehow. And so I could see how I had changed over these shorter periods of time. But over the 3 years, it's kind of impossible to be able to gauge. Definitely, retreat as a whole made me a lot happier and a lot less afraid of what's underneath the surface, because I know, and I have the capacity to be able to work with whatever comes up. And I really know that about myself. There aren't things that I don't know as much. There are always things that come up, but there's less surprises, I guess. So I feel really incredibly grateful for the experience. And it continues to, I continue to have different ways of relating to it. In one sense, I've really realized recently what deprivation it is to be alone for that long, and how really as human beings we're social creatures, and that we need each other, and that there's really something of deprivation by not being around people and not having people to attune to my needs and to attune to other people's needs, and to be part of human connection is really a sense of deprivation. And then also at the same time recognizing that in that experience, and really not having any other ambitions or any other distractions or any other things that I was working on or things that I was doing, to really be able to full-time 100% give myself to the Dharma, how incredible that opportunity really was, and how hard I worked at it, and how rewarding it actually really was and is.
Can you say more about that? I guess the hard work, because you are in a structured environment. I mean, you're practicing many hours, and I would love to hear just about that, just kind of the devotion and discipline it took, and also the reward, like what you actually experienced. Minus, I think you've shared a little bit too, in terms of the fact that you can relate to anything, like anything that comes up, you're not afraid that you won't have what it takes within you to meet what arises in your life.
I've been thinking lately, just the last couple of weeks, about, I think it's something that Tukosan Rinpoche said, that the Dharma belongs to those who put in the work. The Dharma belongs to those who put in the effort. That it's great to be inspired, and it's great to have blessings, and it's great to go to group retreats, and it's great to get teachings, but it's really the work that you put into the Dharma is what you get out of it. And so in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, retreat, the word Tsam, which is what we refer to as retreat, literally means boundary. So you create these boundaries of both physical boundaries, like where you won't physically go out of, and then also creating your meditation sessions of meditating 4 times a day, 2 to 3 hours each session. And then beyond that, in the post-meditation period, really trying to hold your practice and really trying to hold your mind in the practice. And it's much harder than you would think to really engage. Even though there's nothing else going on, the mind just wants to be distracted. And it's amazing how boring my thoughts could get, and yet still there they were. There was literally nothing to think about, and yet my mind still has thoughts and still comes up, and how to work with all of that. So
we could talk about that for a long time. Why the mind does that. Do you have any thoughts just to help people, that have meditation practices, and also maybe have the belief that there's an issue with our thoughts, there's an issue with the constant cyclical nature or desire of our mind?
That's the way the mind is.
Yeah.
That's the nature of the mind, is that things just arise. And it's what we do with it that counts. I'm a person who has a lot of thoughts. I have a lot of ideas. I like thinking.
We might talk about one of them later.
And I'm not a person that represses things very well. I'm not a person that can just shove things down. And so it's really about working with the thoughts as they arise and getting used to them, getting used to all of the variety of things that can arise, and being able to bring them onto the path and to make them useful. I used to think in retreat that if something negative happened, like I was having a negative experience in my mind or a negative experience with my practice, that was purification, that I was getting rid of some old stuff. And if I was having a really beautiful experience and feeling really good, that was inspiration to keep practicing. And so either way, it was all useful. It could all be utilized, that there's nothing that's worthless. that a negative experience in meditation, depending on what you do with it, actually can be the biggest boon for your practice. Where a positive experience, if you get attached to it and you have pride around it, or you see it as rather than seeing it as an inspiration to practice more, you see it as well, I guess I've arrived. I guess I don't need to practice anymore. But that can really be a detriment to your practice. So it's all about how you use experiences. It's not about wanting good experiences and not wanting bad experiences. It's about embracing all of them and using all of them, because there's nothing that can't be used.
Well, I would also love to just talk about the 3-year, 3-fortnight timeline that's, suggested for traditional retreat, and you being the queen of wind, that time was determined based on the inner wind energy expended in one's lifetime.
Yeah, in Jamgon Kongtrul's retreat guide, he talks about how in each breath, 1/32 of a breath is wisdom wind. And so, and because the ideal human lifespan is 100 years, and because it's possible to gain enlightenment in one lifetime, that the amount, if you were just breathing wisdom wind, the amount of time that it would take to get enlightened would be 3 years. For me, the 3-year period, there was something that shifted for me after 3 years. There did feel like there was something in that amount of time. And it also felt like that's the minimum amount of time to just get a slight taste of these practices. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition is so rich with all of these amazing practices. And to even just get a little tiny taste, you need to spend a few months on each one. So I feel like 3-year retreat was just barely getting under the surface.
Do you think if you were raised as a monastic, and this is all, we're just guessing here, but can you imagine if you were raised in that culture and then you went into 3-year retreat, then it being a little even, more fruitional in that state?
When I was in 3-year retreat, I thought that the way that I was doing it, of not seeing anybody and really having complete isolation, was really the traditional way of doing solitary retreat. And what I've realized since being out of retreat is that that's more hardcore in terms of aloneness than the traditional Asian 3-year retreats, certainly, where they do them in groups and you see each other, and maybe there are different boundaries in terms of whether you talk or whether you don't talk, but you're around other people who are doing the same thing. Or even solitary retreat, where maybe you have an attendant, or maybe there are other yogis and yoginis in caves next to you that are also doing retreat, and maybe you can't see them, but you can hear them. So I think in some ways, my solitary retreat got kind of culturally mixed up with the Thoreau hero going into the woods to conquer the inner demons and outer demons, and then to come out and be successful somehow, and I think that there was some aspect of that was a Western idea of what it's like to do retreat that maybe is not so traditional and maybe not so useful. This idea that I'm going to do it all by myself and not see anybody and be super hardcore and fight off animals. And yeah.
I like hearing that your mind is so open to see that maybe it was just the right thing for you. Obviously it was, it's what you did. But there's also the potential of it maybe there being a better way. Maybe we don't need to be alone for 3 years. We can do it in community. I know for myself, if I'm around people in silence, I just want to talk to them. If I'm told to be quiet around people, all I want to do is talk. But if I'm alone and there's nobody there, I can't be naughty. So I wonder what that would have been like for you in that period of time being around people. Do you have that kind of discipline?
Yeah, I can occasionally follow rules. I think the benefit of being in a group of people or being around other people is not so much the talking versus not talking, but being able to attune to each other. That just seeing other people and having some sort of attunement with them is really about human connection. And I did have that. My retreat mate, Jampa, we never saw each other. we'd come out for teachings and see each other at that point. And then there was one period of 4 months where we were practicing once a week together. But there was this deep, deep bond between us, even though we didn't see each other. And this real feeling, like just knowing that he was there doing the retreat, even though our boundaries didn't intersect, our retreat cabin boundaries didn't intersect, just knowing that he was doing it along with me and that we were somehow in it together, and that was really helpful. And I imagine just that if you were in a community of people that were doing retreat, that even if you weren't talking to them, even if you weren't in direct contact, just knowing that people are doing it as well, and that you're with a group of people, you're with a community of people doing something, I think is really nourishing.
The transition out of retreat, this very particular environment, into this world. Can you share a little bit about that?
I think the experience of retreat is somewhat similar to being in the womb, where you're just in this tight enclosed space and you're having this experience, and it's really pretty far out from what everybody else is doing. But at a certain point, it just becomes your life. Like, when you do like a week or a month retreat, you have your life, and then you leave your life and you go do this retreat, and then you come back to your life. Where for a 3-year retreat, you go into this retreat and retreat becomes your life, and then you come out and you don't have a life and you have to figure out how to function. I felt like when I left retreat, I felt like I didn't have any hands. I felt like I couldn't do anything. I didn't know how to, and I also didn't really know how to interact with people very well. And I also felt like I didn't have any skin. Like I didn't know what my fashion sense was. And that seems kind of superficial, but I didn't know how I dress so that I can express myself, or what my persona is in the world. I didn't have any way of kind of organizing myself about how to relate to people. And so it was very confusing for me about just how to act, or how to present myself, or how to relate to people, or how to work, and what I wanted out of life, and all of those questions. And it took a really, really long time. And I still feel in some ways like I'm still transitioning out of that, and still figuring out what the retreat meant, and what being in the world means, and how to really use the world, my experience in the world, in the same way that I used my experience in retreat. Because retreat is a really protected place to practice, and a really protected way to use my post-meditation to enhance my spiritual practice. But how am I doing that in the world? How much easier is it in the world to get overwhelmed and to get distracted, and to find really nice, easy ways to not relate to myself? And so how can I use my experience in the world to enhance my spiritual practice in the same way that I use my post-meditation and retreat? So I feel like there's still a lot of questions that I don't have answers to, and that I'm enjoying finding answers to.
In gratitude to our listeners, and to support the making of this podcast, we want to let you know that you receive 10% off our shop of online courses and botanical delights, including tonics, teas, and beauty care. Visit oliviaclementine.com, and at checkout enter the code LOVE and LIBERATION for the discount. And if you've enjoyed this, please leave a review and rating through iTunes. This helps this podcast become more visible to new listeners. Thank you, and now on to part 2 of today's conversation. Stands out to me is that feeling of coming out to this world that without skin, the tenderness that you can really allow yourself to come into in retreat, because you are so protected in so many ways, and then coming into this world and kind of the fullness of attack that the modern world can offer itself on a human being's heart and mind. And it just feels really rich, and I appreciate that you're enjoying it the process rather than just wanting it to be over or wanting to know how to make the most of this moment in your life.
Yeah, it was definitely hard for a few years. It's definitely things have gotten a lot easier as time has gone by since leaving retreat.
Yeah.
Yeah, the sense perceptions were really overwhelming coming out of retreat, and feeling just flooded on a sensory level. Mm-hmm. From being completely isolated and having such few sensory stimulants, to being out in the world, and our world moves so fast. Also, I missed a lot of things that happened in 3 years. A few months after I'd come out of retreat, my first time after I left Taramandala, I went to Philadelphia. I was on my way to New York to see my family, and I was in Philly hanging out with a dear friend, and she's an amazing activist, and does all these beautiful things to help people, and so I was hanging out with her, and she was working, and so her and her assistant were talking about Twitter, and I said, "What's a hashtag?" And they were like, "What?" And then I asked her what Occupy was. And this was years after Occupy happened, and I had never heard of it. I didn't know, and her trying to come up with an answer of, it's something that everybody experienced or everybody saw happen. And to miss that in an entire way, it was really, you kind of don't ever catch up. It's kind of, it's kind of more like reading a history book or something.
Interesting.
You just miss things that happened and affected the culture. And I wish that there was a way to help people coming out of 3-year retreat, because it's such an incredibly difficult process. Mm-hmm. That was my experience. And I know other people have had that experience also, of just trying to find a place in the world. And our culture doesn't really see that kind of experience as valuable. Mm-hmm. And there's, we're so focused on productivity and what did you do and what did you accomplish and that kind of stuff. And there's nothing. What did I accomplish? Like, I could tell you the practices that I did, but you would just say that's all, it's all just meditation. What are, what did you?
All your imagination.
Yeah, it's all in your head. But it was really, really potent. And I don't know if there's another way of doing it. I'd like to think, you could just practice in the world and really bring each moment into, to enhance your practice. But it's just so much easier in the world to get distracted and to be comforted by other things, where with retreat, it's just so sink or swim. Mm-hmm. It's, if you're not in the practice and really plugged in spiritually, you're having a really difficult time. That's the main connection, is the spiritual connection, where there really aren't other connections. There's no other way to feel less lonely or less afraid, or it all goes back to the practice in your spiritual connection.
It's so true, because in this day and age, we can practice in our home. And even if we practice for a few hours during the day, we can then feel whatever arises during practice. We can sedate it if it's at all uncomfortable, or if it's, whatever the state is. I can't quite fathom what an alternative would be. I mean, how can you recreate that? I mean,
yeah, in retreat, I would daydream about being in an airport. And not because I wanted to go anywhere, but because just the idea of just being in a place where I could just watch people and have nothing to do, and just to be able to have that free time. Because retreat is so structured. People think it's there's a lot of time, and there really isn't. You're practicing, or you're eating, or you're doing chores to survive, or you're reading Dharma. It's there's not a whole lot of time where, when you're not in retreat, you can spend a few hours at the airport because you got there early and you're just watching people. Although now when I'm in an airport, I'm just on my phone, just completely distracting myself. But from my retreat perspective, it was, wow, I could just sit there and just watch people and just relax.
That is so fascinating.
Yeah, that was I also couldn't imagine how you would have time to watch a movie. Like, where do people get time to do that? I just don't understand. I couldn't fathom life without my 4 sessions.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine what a day would be like where I didn't have that kind of intense discipline. And in some ways, I kind of used up all my discipline in retreat because I just don't have it like that anymore. Like, I used every ounce of discipline that I have.
That was your lifetime discipline?
Yeah. That's my lifetime of discipline. Yeah. Where it took me, I set my alarm and I gave myself this amount of time between sessions and, really had an incredible amount of discipline, no days off, just real focus on the practice. And I haven't found that kind of willingness to do that for anything else. And everything's worked out. Everything's been fine. And I do work hard, but just not on that same level of doing it no matter what.
Mm-hmm. Obviously you found your path. I mean, the fact that that's the kind of discipline you had, and that's incredible for 3 years to practice with that kind of focus. It's so inspiring, Beth.
Another piece of coming out of retreat is that I didn't know what I liked to wear. But it was also because I didn't have any clothes when I came out of retreat. I just had my Dharma robes and that was it. And they were like in tatters. And so I went to the thrift store and tried to buy some clothes, but I didn't even know what I liked. Pants felt weird. It was strange. It took me almost a year to figure out like how I dress. And I don't know why that felt so important, but there was something about that of just not knowing how to present myself to the world that was so intense.
That's so fascinating. It makes me think that maybe you should start like a retreat clothing line, like post-retreat clothing line.
I think that's for each individual to discover. An in-retreat clothing line, now that would be very useful. Clothes that don't need to be washed, clothes that don't get old, clothes that don't get holes in them, that just stay looking exactly the same.
I think I know what it is. Skin. It's free.
It's free. It doesn't keep you all that warm, but.
True. We'll have to figure that out.
Yeah. We'll
the warm line.
Sure.
Can I ask you a couple Dharma questions?
Sure.
So there's a little bit from an article that you wrote I want to read. Being fully alive is being awake in the midst of the life, even those difficult, prickly sensations we try and avoid. We sometimes assume that only with proper circumstances we will feel ease and joy. We spend endless time and energy fixing our outer world in the hope that that will fix our inner world. And yet it simply doesn't work. We must find the willingness to work with our circumstances as they are right now. In fact, unanswered desire is where life itself is lived. The French use the phrase le petit mort, the little death, to refer to orgasm. The orgasm is the moment of fulfillment, the release of the moment, the tension and connection of desire. Climax is the satisfaction, yet also marks the end point, the moment of separation. The release of dynamic tension is a death. Our hope for satisfaction is ultimately the wish to cease to exist right now. Not only do we lose right now, but we also end up hurrying to the grave. So Beth wrote that. And I wanted to talk about how we may be hurrying ourselves to the grave without maybe even knowing it, and maybe even a potential antidote.
Yeah, I think we always think that if things were better, then particularly with spiritual practice, if my conditions were better, then I'd feel spiritual, and be able to practice well. If I was in retreat, I'd be able to practice well. If if I had more time, if I had more sleep, if I had more this, or, tomorrow I'll be able to practice well. And at the very end of my retreat, I had this whole fantasy about this other retreat that I was going to do and how that retreat was going to be really, really great. And I had all of these ideas about where it would be and how it would be and how amazing it would be. And then I had a moment of realizing, you're in retreat now. This is your moment to practice. What are you doing? And I feel like that we get so caught up in later I'll be able to practice, but actually it's in every moment. And there's no moment that's not a possibility, regardless of what we're doing, regardless of whether we're feeling inspired or not. It's all potential for practice. And even if we're sitting on the cushion and there's 1,000 million thoughts going through our minds and it's feeling really not spiritual, we're still practicing, and that's still the practice. And how do we
talk about that? Like when you say we're practicing, just what that means too.
I think it's less important what comes up and more important what we do with it. There's a notion of what's called a critical eruption, which is something that happens in your practice that seems really negative but propels your practice forward. And then there's also an obstacle, something that's a hindrance to your practice, that's an obstacle to realization or to progressing on the spiritual path. And so at one point I asked Tuko Rinpoche, well, what's the difference between the two of them? Because in the moment when negative things come up, they feel terrible. So how do you know if it's a critical eruption, something that's moving your practice forward, or an obstacle, something that's hindering your practice? And he said that it's what you do with it that matters. And that the only way to judge your practice is to see where your devotion and your compassion are. If your devotion and compassion are increasing, then your practice is going well. And if your devotion and practice are decreasing, that means your practice is not going well. So regardless of how things seem or how things feel, that it's all about how you react to things. If you have a really profound sign in your practice, you have a vision or a dream or something that feels really amazing or just like a great experience, and you feel like, I got it, man, my practice is the thing, I can't wait to tell everybody about this because this is the best, then that's an obstacle. It's bringing up pride, it's making you less inspired to practice, giving you less compassion. And on the other hand, if you have a really negative experience and that really propels you to practice more and really inspires you to have compassion for other people who are suffering and really clears you out of some negative stuff that you were holding on to, and that's really a boon for your practice. Mm-hmm. And so we can never really know what's good and what's bad about in our practice. It's really about how we use it and what the results are. And so remembering that and not taking things so seriously. Oh, I'm having a really bad day on the cushion, like that means my practice is going terrible and I'm never going to be a practitioner and I guess it's all hopeless. But instead being like, I guess I'm purifying some karma. I guess there's some things that are coming up and I'm pushing through these things and I'm going to look back at this as a really transformative time, even though it sucks right now. This is something that I can use. This is the manure to move my practice forward.
That's so good. So how are we relating to our life, and are we increasing in devotion and compassion? Rather than what's actually happening.
No, and we have to work with what's happening. Of course, we can make efforts to change things for the better, certainly. And at the same time, we can't fix things right now. And so to think, oh, I can just wait, I'm just going to wait until things get better. And then I'm really going to practice. Once I'm in the perfect retreat, then I can really practice. Or, once things just settle and I feel good, then my practice, at first I have to feel good, then I can practice. Mm-hmm. That's never going to happen because it's our ego that wants to be happy and wants to have pleasure and wants to be fulfilled and wants everything to be great. And so once that happens, then we'll be like, great, why should I practice? This is amazing. Life is so good. Who needs the spiritual path? Mm-hmm. So really every moment is an opportunity to practice, and really there's no perfect retreat. There's no ideal circumstances. We can just do our best with whatever we have, while at the same time, obviously trying to make things better for ourselves and for the world. But most of the time we can't change things instantly.
Yeah. Thank you. We put a lot of emphasis in our culture on creation and order, and we have all these ideas of what success means. Reminds me of your retreat, just this idea of coming out of retreat and being being asked of the world, like, well, what did you really accomplish? And you and I both know, and how many of our listeners will know, that things are always coming together and falling apart. And I would love if you could just talk more about the success of chaos and failure, and just like to bring some warmth to those topics, rather than this desire to wish that the world was permanent and things stayed together and we could, that there is some idea that success is some kind of consistency rather than the nature of things.
Well, I think maybe success could be defined as getting what we want. And maybe in not getting what we want, there's a sense of humility. I think we also have this idea that if our practice is going well, we'll be able to prevent bad things from happening to people we love, or bad things from happening in the world. And that somehow, if bad things happen, then it's somehow our fault. And I think it's just samsara. And bad things just happen. And sometimes we don't get what we want. And sometimes we get what we want, and then it turns out it wasn't really what we want. Mm-hmm. And I think there's humility in that. I don't know if there's fully an end to the path. We talk about enlightenment like it's a destination. I don't know if it's a destination or a journey. We talk about enlightenment like it's one thing. And then if you really look at it, then there are all the different bhumis. And you could say, oh, there are the 10 bhumis, and then there are the 13 bhumis. And then it's always kind of expanding in the Tibetan Buddhist system. Mm-hmm. Particularly with spiritual practice, instead of having a goal of where we're going to end up, that it's a lifelong process, and we do our best at whatever phase we are in it. If we're just starting out, if we've been practicing a long time, if we practiced for a while and then slacked off for a while and came back to it, or I think it's all about, I think in large ways and in small ways, it's all about forgetting and then remembering. We learn something and we think, oh, this is it, and I'm never going to forget it. And then we forget it, and then we remember it, and then we forget it, and then we remember it. And just remembering it more, I think maybe is the goal. So I don't know if that answers your question about success, but
the success of chaos.
The success of chaos.
Well, I mean, I think what I'm hearing from you kind of in this whole conversation is it's not about what happens. It's really about how we respond to it. And so it sounds to me like success is responding to the chaos rather than wanting it to be something other than it is. And
I think as honestly as we can relate to things.
Yeah.
And also being compassionate with ourselves if we need distraction.
Yeah.
That's also part of the, sometimes when we go through really hard things, we can't deal with them nakedly and rawly and just be in it. It's too much. And so sometimes we need to take a break a little bit, and that's okay too.
You have a new career. You are about to become a therapist.
I just finished a master's in counseling psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute. There are some bureaucratic hoops I need to jump through that are going to take longer than I think they ought to. But once I get through those, I'll be a LMHC, a licensed mental health counselor in the state of New Mexico.
So beautiful. And have you found any kind of contradictions between Buddhist philosophy and all of your therapeutic studies?
Well, I feel like Buddhism studies how to become enlightened and how to become realized and the true nature of mind. And psychology studies all of the dysfunction of our samsaric minds. Mm-hmm. And so in that way, they're both looking at the nature of mind, but they're looking at it from different perspectives, I think. But I feel like Western psychology is a really good map of how we've gone wrong. And Buddhism's a really good map of how to get out of that. So they're kind of, that's how I see them. And I I tend not to try to look for contradictions in things, because once I do that, I can find a million ways how things don't work. I just like to look at things in the way that they're most helpful. If that makes sense.
That. I mean, you're going to be a dream therapist, just the fact that you are looking at both angles. I mean, if anyone's in New Mexico, they should be hitting up Beth, because what a gift that you are such a deep explorer of both the modern world, what went wrong, and the true nature of mind. And I'm curious if you're going to keep your Dharma path hush hush, or if you're going to outwardly be a Buddhist therapist.
I don't exactly know. In my internship, I worked with young kids, which I really enjoyed. And there's not much. Obviously, I'm not going to teach them Dharma. It was really about helping parents and their children be able to relate in a way that really helps the children develop well emotionally and socially. And so I still feel like, in a similar way to feeling called to do retreat, I feel kind of called to this profession, and I don't exactly know where I'm going to land in it or how that's going to unfold, but I also kind of like that we'll see what happens. And I hope that I can be of benefit to the best of my ability. I feel like in working with clients so far, I've done some mindfulness stuff, but more than that, I felt like my inner practice can be helpful without even saying anything, without even using jargon, or clearly I'm not going to try to convert people or try to have them somehow become Buddhist like me, but more, how can I use the experiences that I've had and the suffering that I've had and the ways that I've worked through it? How can I use that to really benefit people? And so that's been more how I've focused. And so I don't know. I have no idea how my career will unfold, or I just hope to be able to be of benefit however that happens.
Well, Beth, you are so precious. I mean, just your intention of benefiting people from such an open mind, because I think so many of us want to jump into something. We feel like we need to know, we need to have answers. And it's nice to be around you and to have that kind of spaciousness and kindness and, really pure intentions. Thank you for sharing today. And do we talk about the cat sitcom?
Yeah, so today I had an idea. So please, anybody who can make this happen, please do this. This would be a great idea and a great benefit to the world. But it would be a television show called The Catchlorette. And so it would be one woman or man, we're not sexist here, and they would have a house full of cats. And then they would have to slowly narrow down what cats until it would be the cat that they would adopt. But of course, as they'd eliminate each cat, the cat would be adopted by some loving family who would really take good care of the cat. And all of the cats would be shelter cats. And so it would raise awareness for animal shelters and maybe make money for the animal shelters. All the proceeds would go towards helping stray animals. The whole show would just be kittens playing. And they'd have different challenges for the kittens. It would be yarn day, where all the kittens would play with yarn. And then the person would just watch the kittens and be like, oh, I think I like this kitten. Oh, no, I think I like this kitten. And then it would be just so painful to have to choose the one cat to take home. But you'd know that all of the cats would get adopted to really nice, loving homes. So it'd all be a happy ending to the story. But I think that'd be the best television show ever.
Yeah, so Beth's looking for a producer. You can either email her if you are someone that wants to make the show come to reality, or if you want to make the show come to reality. I personally would recommend at least telling Beth that you're going to take on the project. You can see the benefits of 3-year retreat and having, getting a master's in therapy.
Then you want to produce television shows.
You never know where the road will take you.
Absolutely. Forgot about all the stuff I've ever done. Now I'm going to go into producing reality shows based on cats.
Well, who knows? You're so open. If I interview you in a year,
yeah,
who's to say?
I don't know. I do hope that I can benefit people in a deeper and more serious way than producing reality shows about cats. Although I do see value in that as well.
Beautiful, Beth. Well, I think this is really where we should end our conversation.
Yeah. Thank you, Olivia. Thank you for everything. Lovely talking to you.
Lovely talking to you.